people who speak Spanish as a threat. So that's something that I just couldn't ignore. A student took a picture of this flyer for Spanish development playgroup, and this one is in a different neighborhood, but it's also, they said it's really geared toward non-native speakers of Spanish, and you don't see the same kind of validation or promotion of Spanish for heritage speakers of Spanish or native speakers of Spanish.
I'm just gently reminding about time. We're at around 10. So
Okay.
if you can take a few more minutes and then we can move on to other work. Thank you, Carla.
Sure, this kind of wraps it, I'll wrap it up. This is a middle school where the only multilingual sign was this flyer from the Department of Agriculture policies, you know, in the high school cafeteria. So that's the only multilingual thing there. This is just showing, a student took a picture of the fact that something very useful in the city had just one little line saying, you know, here, call here if you speak Spanish, to get instructions. This is a whole nother story, but this is actually was a nationwide story of a cheesesteak place in South Philadelphia. These signs have been taken down, but they were up from like 2007 to 2016. Not surprisingly, Trump visited this place when he was campaigning in 2015. So again, that's a long story, but intersections, I want just to end with this, because even though I'm looking at monolingualism, multilingualism, of course, in classes, we talk about how all of this intersects with race, ethnicity, and different kinds of identities. And also within these communities, I have found the communities, I'm doing a study right now of 2 communities that are both politically progressive, community oriented, really promoted as desirable places to live. One of them is majority African-American Black, the other is majority white. And in the community that's majority white, the only Black Lives Matter signs are these, the ones that couch and embed that message within a lot of other messages. Yet in the neighborhood that's mostly African-American and Black, you see much more kind of confrontational signs and homemade signs. So this is something else that we're starting to kind of unravel in classes, and that I'm doing on my own. So that's it. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Carla. And we would love to hear more about the work. And thank you for, hopefully we'll get a chance to do that in the dialogue. We're going to go on to Lucius's work now. And we're excited to see the connections that emerge.
All right, so I'll try to keep it short as well. I have the timer going. So after looking at everybody's presentations, I'm mainly going to pull on stuff that I can think that it's not mentioned other places. So I'll just give a shout out if I heard it in other presentations for today. So a little bit about me. I'm here in Japan. So I've been teaching here for the last 10 years. The university I'm talking about today, I still work for, but I do a satellite program for them now, but I was there for 6 years developing their media program. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about that. I also am at Teachers College for a doctorate in the media and communication, and I work with Mass Collab there. So those are the 2 places I'm at. Okay, so co-constructed media curriculum and process of meaning making. I think meaning making is maybe what this panel got put together with, that key phrase. So I think both, yeah, I think it's touched on throughout. So I'll try to skip through that. So this is kind of the outline, obviously. The EFL setting, as Carla mentioned earlier, it kind of has a crossover. So one thing I have to admit, I am here in Japan, and how does that work with Conference of Americas? And something that I noticed, what I'll be talking about is rewriting media curriculum, like a campus-wide media curriculum for international communication program. And one of the big problems with it, without pointing out like specific anecdotal stories, is in that setting, the teacher is seen as a skill-based teacher because it's second language acquisition in some of the courses, whether it be Portuguese or Spanish or English. The teacher is seen as like, these are explicit skills, these are ways to learn language, though there's diversity in that as well. But and then when it becomes a content-based course, it kind of overlaps. And that teacher's skill is judged as skill when it's talking only about opinion. And I think that's where it becomes a little problematic. So I'll talk about that. And I think when Carla was mentioning like the lack of representation in the content for the students when there's international teachers. So I'll explain the process-based, which I think is unique for this, which links with JD's kind of process of thinking of how to judge curriculum and how to organize it. And then a little bit about modality, but I really like the film stuff, and I really like how much Carla touched on all the modalities that are out there. Oh, I forgot to mention, if you're bored with what I'm saying, you can hop onto the site that I'll be talking about and just look at the student works and materials there. If you're more interested in the applied stuff, that's the course website. Okay, so this is the important quote, right? So English education today needs to equip EFL learners to problematize the realities represented in media and to challenge the social cultural assumptions and inequalities embedded within English education. Sorry. It's 3:30, my eyes are sore. So I think this is really important. Like I said, it's valuing the students. And I think media literacy really allows that. And media courses really allow that with language learning, in my setting at least. The process-based. Now this is the unique part of this, is we address like how do you include multimodality? How do you include all of this with some structure? And this is what we worked on with the process-based system of basically looking at the process that students go through opposed to the material that we were giving them directly. So for example, if you give a worksheet to students, you're going to have 20 different outcomes in that class. I think I used that example in the video, but to judge it as if that is a standardized thing it's false. It's even though you're claiming it to be standardized because it's this one product, what people are bringing into that is completely different. So these are the bands. So problem solving would be with language, and I think this is really neat that this was built through thinking about language. But I think language and communication is quite universal. And JD will talk about this, I think, a bit more on like, how do you rate stuff and what kind of skill bases do you look at with critical media literacy? And I think with this, looking at this, we were looking at how can you communicate your meaning making? And that was the explicit skill that we're really judging, and that we can fairly judge. So not necessarily your meaning making and how well you do that, but more how can you express that to other people? And that's the other side of it. So problem solving would be, with language, it'd be like, I want to be able to do this skill, or I want to be able to communicate this idea. I don't know how can I address this? Theory and communication would be, okay, there's a lot out there already. Let me appreciate that and look at what other, we're not just making it up. And then extended interaction would be searching out perspectives, different perspectives. Self-analysis would be looking at your own perspective and your own personal history, which I think is really cool in the media lit videos, that it's really the students in those films often bring in their own histories in that. And I think I really like that when watching your video. The data analysis is really the statistical, step back or survey and look at the world in a different way. Just like us, looking at a graph can be the same as looking at a painting, or just a different understanding of things, a different way of meaning making. And audio and visual is the classic text. and everything out there. So I'll hop over the site just for a second, but please have at it. This is an example of the site. These would be the processes. This would be the multiple lessons that students could decide from. And students would vote, and then we'd move forward. That's the co-constructive side. And I think that's the challenge with media literacy, is we keep talking about students add so much, let's listen to them, let's hear what they have, but listen to me and tell me what you think of what I have. And I think that's a weakness there. And so what we were trying to do was give as many options as possible, but still have some facilitation, that not just be like, hey, everybody, what's media? Let's go your way. And I think that's not fair to students. That's like asking somebody, what's your wish for the world? Like it's a rehearsed answer. So I think we had this menu to help students just think of ideas. And each class can be completely different. So if you look here, this year, students picked these courses and these lessons. Previous one, they picked different ones. What's really interesting, because they have access to previous student sites, they're gonna gravitate towards what they see and what they like. So they're not gonna try as many new things as I would like to see. But that's okay, the familiarity. Okay, so that's the processes, that's the co-constructed. I think media, meaning making, I think is covered really well, as I mentioned in other presentations today. But again, I want to just touch on the structure and thinking about that. And again, what I showed you there was a semiotics unit. We had sound units. You know, there's multiple units in there. The first semester was really about exploration. The second semester was more about production. I do film production, and I do film classes as well and things like that. So it does get put in there, obviously, but I try to step back with that and have the students explore. I'm really about whatever they have their hands on. So everything, obviously we had computers sometimes and editing systems, but I really tried to make sure they were using their mobile devices or whatever they had, so that it would continue on with them. So it's their knowledge, their digital literacy is in their hands. Yeah. So I think I'm running out of time here, I see. But yeah, I think I'll stop at that. But again, I think that's, if you want to look at co-constructing and look at different approaches and how to organize that, I think that website is a really good way to just see an example of that and how it was approached. And yeah. And I think the last thing I'd touch on is just that, again, we were looking at how well can you communicate that? And that's where we went with the rubric. And the students, I'm really sorry that I didn't have enough time to show students work, but I think that's a really good way to understand the process. And if you click at home here, sorry, pull down, you can see students' works.
If you want to take 2 or 3 minutes to share, I think
Okay.
we can work that in. That's fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if you click on any student's work, you can see how they figured to organize their work in a portfolio. The sites are just quite easy. They're just pre-made sites that they plug and play stuff in. But so they would do, I think in the video I showed someone else's one of this. So this would be this student's childhood fear. And they're thinking about semiotics. They're bringing in their history of what they perceive as fear, what elements and meaning making in that, but then they're also analyzing, like, how does that fit into the larger society, and how is that enforced in me? How has that come across? I think one I didn't share, I'm not sure. They also do, talking about multimodality, they interviewed, like, so obviously music, television, this is not their generation, but they picked it. So they interviewed someone who it was debuted for. So a grandparent or parent, and they talked about that. So that was the modality of interview, things like that, themselves producing. Production's fun if you have time to click around and look at people's production. And I think, yeah, I'd like to show you one of the, this one's good for their data analysis. So this is another way, like tying in with Carla's thing, they were looking at semiotics of safety signs. And so from their walk from home to school, they would stop and kind of check out every safety sign and write about it and think about it and what that means. And if they're universal, if they're very text heavy, like for example, this one, I don't know how many people here, if there was an emergency, if you came to this, what you would do if it's completely text and no image. Anyway, so just thinking about that. So those are some of the modalities that they played with. And I think touching on that, modality adds different ways to share your thoughts. And it gives more freedom to students on a way that they can convey something that they might not feel comfortable otherwise. And it helps pull their knowledge in and their history. Yeah.
Powerful. Thank you, Lucius, for sharing and opening up your practice with us so we can see those structures that shape the work and allow for that student agency and choice without just making it about the teacher's preconceived notions. I think that's a challenge in so much of what we term critical work, right? Next, we're going to go to JD's work. We're really excited for this next session. Great.
Okay, I'm going to share and see it okay. Yes. Good. Okay, great. I'm going to take a cue from Lucius and continue to try to connect dots, I think, with the presentation after mine. That'll be very easy, but also with things that Lucius and Carla have covered. So the project name, again, my name is JD Swerzenski. I am a PhD candidate at UMass, and this is part of my dissertation project. I'm about midway through it. So one, this is kind of a check-in. I get to emphasize the critical media literacy portion of it. And two, I get to try to recruit some of y'all, hopefully, to be a part of it. I'm still looking for interview participants. So have that in the back of your mind as I go through. And what I'm interested in is making alternative media matter through critical media production. The thing I'm really going to focus on here is mattering. That's the phrase or the word that's doing a lot of the work in my presentation today. But before I do that, I want to ground these two terms: alternative media, which I'm taking especially from Kellner and Scher and critical media literacy. So this idea of producing against hegemonic text, and media production, which is my background. Most of the courses I teach are video production, audio production, also some photography courses. And I'm interested in that writing element of media literacy that production offers as praxis, as this way to take the theoretical, the conceptual conversations, the critical conversations we're having, and put them into a text that can matter. And I'm specifically focused on college level classrooms. Not only that's where I teach, but I think they're an undervalued, underseen site because we have the potential of producing producers. These students are going to come out and make media that could be seen by huge audiences. So I think it's an important place to highlight. Okay, so let me get into the terms a little bit more. Alternative media production. So not my idea that media production can be a valuable critical literacy tool. Buckingham talks about this as this dialectical relationship between doing and analyzing, between practice and theory. Morell and his team, I love the study they did in East LA, having students, giving them cameras, and in their case, seeing their own perceptions in the media. These are Latino youth from East LA. They're portrayed as gangbangers often in a lot of media texts. So they analyzed that role and then did something about it. They take cameras, they go out in their community, they film something different, they come back, they edit it, and they produce a story, in this case, a small documentary that can counter that. So that's kind of like the ideal of this, right? Of not just analyzing what's wrong with media, but doing something about it. And I think a really great example there. And just to finish this out, so a lot of these I have up here, though, they're kind of taking it from this other direction where you have an English course or you have, a writing course, and then you add a production element onto it, right? So instead of a final essay, you do a video, you do a podcast, you do something like that, right? I'm interested in, again, this perspective of classes where skills are in the foreground, where their main idea is to teach you how to edit videos, to produce media, to get a job with these skills. And I think, let me go on. And I think those classes provide a unique set of challenges, mainly because they have historically not been sites of critical thinking. They're taught as technical training. I've got a few texts here. Lynn Masterman, going back to 85, talks about the technicist trap, how you just worry about, making sure you know how to work the camera, you know how to work the software, and then those critical conversations, they're out the window. So these sorts of labs become reproduction labs. We're just teaching the same skills, inevitably teaching the same conventions, and then only later does that media get critiqued. But the cycle continues, the pipeline remains in place. And as I mentioned earlier, this is incredibly important, I think, for these classrooms because we are producing producers. That's not to say every student is going to go out there and produce Nike commercials or hit films, but these are positions of great influence, even PR campaigns or advertisements, or those who will sit on the board and approve decisions, right? So these students have the potential to go forward and really make these critical ideas count. And yet these sites are not holding up their end of the deal because they are really just reproducing what's already out there. So my interest here is in balance. So in making critical media production matter, I see it as this balance between technical skills and critical concepts and how to make the two work together in the classrooms where you're not in the technicist trap, only worrying about how to work Adobe Premiere or the camera, and the critical side is not getting left aside. So they aren't able to build skills to where they can go out and influence media in this larger way. So we need the technical skills and we need the critical. How do we balance that? I've been trying to figure it out for years, but in this project, I'm not trying to figure out myself. I'm talking to folks who do it on a day-to-day basis. And so I've set the goal of about 25 interviews with media production instructors. I've talked to about 12 so far, including a few folks at this conference, Jeff Scher being one of them. And I'm having these 1-hour conversations via Zoom, talking about how to balance these technical goals, talking about assessment, which Lucius, thank you for bringing that up. I'll continue into that a little bit more. Negotiating production and also more critical pedagogy related goals, supporting student voice in the process of production, not making it just about the right or wrong way, which often technical skill-based classes can be, but having that voice as part of it. And the thing I want to focus on most for today, which is artifacts. So collecting teaching materials, syllabi, assignment descriptions, lecture materials. So we're not conceptually trying to figure out how a critical approach to media production works. This is concrete, like literally how when you walk in the classroom, how do you structure assignments? How do you balance these two things out to where one doesn't overwhelm the other? So both can happen at the same time. So that's what I want to share with you today is a few of these examples and some of the topics I'll cover. Let's go to the first one though, challenging media production practices. So this is from Dr. Annie Laurie Nichols. She's at St. Vincent College and her course, Digital Layout and Design. It's the course that she told me that got her hired. She's got a design background. That's the reason they put her in the job, as she said. She's also a great critical scholar, but it was those skills that put her there in the first place. And I think the thing that was so interesting about speaking with her about this course is how she balances the two, how she has this praxis, not just in the beginning, they learn skills, then they get critical or vice versa. It's all a cycle. It's happening at the same time. So to give you an example, one of her lectures starts with a very typical for a photography lecture, talking about elements of the photo, be it the rule of thirds, leading line, the composition and framing of a photo. 2 slides later, though, she gets critical with it. And she's talking about how those compositional elements relate to perception, relate to emotion, relate to politics in this case. So relating it at that time where she was teaching the Baltimore protests being a major story. So how does each photo portray the event? How do the elements shape the reaction? Putting those technical skills in a critical place, not hoping students connect the dots, but putting them there immediately. And then again, going back around. So the next assignment, they're back into skills. So with that critical discussion, now they get into Photoshop, they're learning these elements, they're talking about balance, direction, lighting, skills, right? They are training to be professionals. And then using those skills for critical ends. So this is the assignment, which is a poster. They choose the image and then it's a photo essay, but using the production tool to write essentially. So just to zoom in on here, doing something like talking about the color composition of the photo, you have to learn color correction tools in Photoshop to do this. Even small things like cropping, adding shapes, it's using the tool to analyze the tool. And I think it's such a clever way to do that. Speaking to assessment, this is a little small. I know it's probably going to be tough to read, but just to kind of glaze over it, I think too, assessment is one of the most important areas here, because it's where, even if you say this is important and this is important, this is where students' eyes are at. They're going to look at the grade and the bottom line. And I think that's something where her intentionality has been so important, where editing is right up front. She doesn't overlook the technical skills. You have to know how to use the tool, but it's always interwoven with those explanations. So the visual explanation is part of that, right? So the form and the content come together here. They're not discrete objects. They work together for the kind of the success of the whole project. I'll just bring in one other example. This is from Dr. Jen Proctor. She's at Western Michigan. And it's an idea from her course that I really liked, because I think the problem there is often students will have one skill or the other. You have a student has great critical ideas, but just doesn't have a production background, and you end up punishing them because, you know, the video is choppy or it's not at the professional level. How she sets this up, and I think it's here. Yeah, I'll go to this one. She has so many bonus assignments in place to where students can add, so she can grade harshly, she can grade at this professional level, and students have plenty of opportunities to make up the points to get them back, which I think small things like that make this assessment so important. If you're balancing the two, you have to give students the space to grow in both ways, because they may not go in tandem with each other. And since I got about a minute left, I also had production as a critical analysis tool. I'm going to skip this because I think David and Harry are going to cover a really, really great example of this in the next presentation, which is using the thing to critique the thing, using video or things like video essays as tools of critique, which I think are so important. So my last minutes, I'll skip over the conclusions. And just to say again, I am still looking for interview subjects. If you teach media production, and obviously we're at a critical media literacy conference, I know you have a critical angle to your teaching, but I would love to speak with you. And if you know somebody who does this work, I'm still looking for about 10 more participants to speak with. And I'm interested in kind of getting into the tension between technology and software, things like, you know, Premiere, Photoshop as teaching tools, as like second teachers in the classroom. Something I think Antero Garcia got into in the introduction, right? How we have to, you know, our critical teaching is not in a vacuum. We're teaching against these tools often, and that's something I'd like to get into. And these professionalization standards, the idea of getting a job, and these things can trump our ability to have critical conversations. So that's also what I'm interested in, how teachers navigate those things. Okay, I think that's it for me.
Great, we're excited for our final presentation, and then we will have some time for rich dialogue. Thank you very much, JD.
Of course, the mute. Thank you very much, everyone. It's very much an honor to be here today. My name is Dr. David Gracon. I'm an assistant professor of integrated media at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. And I brought along with me today one of the producers of the show that I hopefully you were able to watch, or at least catch some of it. Harry Smith is with us today too, and he's a senior and he's interested in going into grad school. So this is his first ever sort of academic conference experience. So I'm going to talk for just about 5 minutes before Harry takes over, and he's going to share his experiences of being a student, and I'll talk about it from the teacher perspective. So this class is advanced television. In this class, students make shows. You know, so typically it's really news driven, or kind of like a talk show, and even sometimes they've done game shows. My background's in critical media studies, and I come from a pretty radical alternative media training from SUNY Buffalo, the Department of Media Study. So I'm bringing that skill set into this department. I'm a new faculty. I'm in my second year at Gonzaga. And so my idea was to bring these ideas of media activism, media literacy, critical theory, and then put it into practice. And so this was actually my first time teaching a studio class. I'm more of a field person. So it's really interesting to see how can we make a show about media literacy. And it was really something that's never been done there. And there's not really a lot of examples to watch to make something. You know, this is really an experiment. And I really like JD's work. Your project's awesome, and I'd be more than happy to talk with you. It really was inspiring actually because I sometimes feel like I'm in a void doing this stuff. But trying to find that balance between critical thinking and critical content and also technical proficiency, and how to pull that off in a studio production is pretty challenging actually. But we gave it a go, and I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I mean, there's some technical issues that occurred, which I think is normal in a student production. But I think the content ended up being pretty spot on, and there's a lot of really good critiques going on in the show in terms of political economy in media, representation. And of course, the making of the show also, was probably a very different style of doing the pre-production. We sat in a big circle. We had an executive producer who was pretty much running the show. She basically was steering the ship, but it was very collaborative, and the students each, selected a portion or a piece that they were going to do. Some of these were pre-recorded packs that they made actually in another class, sort of the video essay thing going on in a couple of those pieces. And then others were things that they made for this show. And then we did it live. We just did the whole show as a live production, which is exciting. And you're kind of living on the edge of your seat with that. I think it's really important to make this bridge between media literacy and production. I think it doesn't happen enough. I think the idea of talking about analysis and critique is vital. Part of media literacy is doing it, and that's what we did with this show. Talking about the political economy of media is vital. How do we, how do students know how to work within an industry if they don't understand how it's actually set up by economics, right? And monopolies and this kind of thing, and the importance of alternative messages and implementing alternative media and media literacy into the program. And of course, education. So we saw the show as being educational. We want to teach others media literacy. I think very few people have access to a media literacy course or training, and that's a major problem. And so we thought, let's make a show that actually is educational and doing media literacy that others can watch. Because even at my university, a very select few students take media literacy, which is our 101 kind of foundation class. So again, trying to take the ideas of theory and put them directly into production. And then in the course, they would do more traditional news, talk shows, even like a sports show. Of course, our basketball team is really big, so they do a whole show about March Madness called Bracketology. So it's really a mix of more standard media practices, but then this assignment was kind of more the curveball in that class. And I think it's important to have a balance of those approaches. So I just want to talk for the first 5 minutes. I'll let Harry take it from here for the next 5 minutes, and he can talk about his experiences as a student in the course and his thoughts about it. So Harry, feel free to take over here.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gracon. So my name is Harry Smith, and I'm a senior at Gonzaga University. And my two majors are broadcast studies and communication studies, which is kind of funny because one of the biggest questions I get when I tell people that is, well, what's the difference? And I think there actually is a pretty big difference, especially at our school. One of the biggest things that I'm so grateful for the experience I've had on both sides is I do feel with my comm degree, I've gotten a lot of practice on doing critical analysis and critical theory. But then also with my broadcast degree, I've been able to apply that, as JD was saying, with like actual praxis, as well as learning like the technological things of how to work a camera, how to edit, all those basic things that you need to create media production. So altogether, I feel like it's been, for me, it was a really cohesive collaboration. And I'm so grateful that my school gave me that option to be able to kind of dip my toes in both sides. So for the show, actually, I think it was really interesting. As Dr. Gracon was kind of saying, our program in particular in the past has focused more on things like just other things going on at the school, especially basketball. Our basketball shows are usually pretty big and get a lot of viewership. But it was really interesting this year to take on a different approach and leaning into the media literacy, which I feel in the past has just kind of been a class that the department has asked us to take, and then we kind of just move on and don't think about it anymore. And especially so Gonzaga being like a Jesuit humanistic university, we're really founded in social justice. And in our mission statement, particularly, we say like, we have a call to stand in solidarity with the poor and vulnerable. And so for our show, that's why I felt really blessed to be able to tap into these areas of media that really get overlooked, particularly like women in media, representation in terms of women, queer people, and then just like getting into other areas that I think as media consumers, we don't think of really critically, like cancel culture. That was one of the big things that we talked about. Like, how do we discuss cancel culture in the current climate that we're in? And like, how can we engage in that in a productive way as media consumers? And then just other parts of the show, like the one piece that I did on kind of media conglomeration and like understanding as a consumer, like who owns the media that I'm watching. And like kind of towards the end of that video, we talked about how like it used to be like you have the people who make it and then the distributors, but as like we've progressed, like that's kind of blurred. And we now have like Netflix that creates and distributes their own stuff. And so like the lines of like who's making things kind of gets kind of muddy, and it's kind of harder to discern. So I think now more than ever, it's kind of really important to be critical analysts of the media that we're consuming. And unfortunately, we were only able to produce that one show before COVID, the pandemic hit, and we had to all go home. But I was really grateful that we were able to produce that one show that I think, for the most part, we did really well. I was really proud of the pre-produced packages that we had done. I do think that if we had had more experience, we would have gotten stronger on like the live production aspects of the show. But overall, I think it was a really great example like of what JD was saying, of having this critical theory of like the media we're analyzing, but then using media to do that critical analysis. I don't know if Dr. Gracon wants to add anything.
Do we have any more time left?
So just about a minute, but we can use that to segue into dialogue, or if you want to say any other aspects of the work in a final minute or two or three.
I'm fine with going into a dialogue.
Great. So we've had these 4 powerful presentations, and thank you to all of our presenters. If we could just take a moment before we transition into the dialogue to just unmute ourselves and show our appreciation for folks for sharing their work, opening up their practice, thinking through these challenges with us. If you'd please unmute yourself, let's give a big round of applause. So thank you. And let's comments, questions, points of intersection. What do we see here in the work? Or if presenters want to comment on each other's work, or what would we like to bring up?
One thing that Harry just touched upon in terms of the difference between broadcasting and communication that I've thought a lot about in recent months and throughout my foray in public radio. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the term broadcasting comes from horticulture in terms of broadcasting seeds. And the term was given to radio because that's kind of what we do, is we put seeds out in the air. Whereas communication is dialogue, it's discourse, it's receiving information at the same time. Well, maybe not exactly at the same time, maybe moments later, but you get my drift. So I just wanted to put that in because Harry reminded me of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's powerful, because one of the things that really emerges for me is the ways we need to think, particularly for folks in my world and in education, about the ways that literacy isn't only reading, it's writing, right? This notion of the production. Of course, we know that a lot of the early work really focused on the analysis side. And I love the way that we're looking at, if you will, both sides of the coin and thinking through how young people, and I think this connects with your project, JD, in education spaces are through, say, technical aspects or through their reading of work, are also learning and thinking about their writing of work, through their consumption and thinking about production. And I know we have Steve Goodman here, the founding director of the Educational Video Center. Having done a training in 2002 with Steve's organization as a teacher in New York City, I remember doing things like looking at a low angle and a high angle with students as we were playing with digital video cameras. And then right after we started to look at these technical skills, having the conversation, what does that do for us as a viewer of what we were just playing with, to think about our relationship with who we're seeing and what we're seeing on the screen. I'm interested in asking JD, if in your, it sounds like you're halfway through your project and your interviews, could you share more about this notion of the technical and the conceptual? Because, as David was talking about the way that political economies shape the work that we do and shape so much of media that is broadcast, that is out there, we need to think about the ways in which we can teach students in ways that are removed from the commodification, so that we really have that space for critical work. And we all know that that's such a challenge. So I love this way of overtly thinking about the technical and the conceptual, so that we can serve some of those needs of saying, yes, we're doing that technical work that is required because we're working within so many different layers and administrations, and but we can really create a space for that critical analysis and critical production. Any thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Remind me the question again.
So could you share, I mean, how are people doing that work?
You made me think, Jeff Scherer was one of the last folks I spoke with about the project about 2 weeks ago. He's in the video when I had a little bit more real estate to work with, but I think something I took from Steve's work and especially that Jeff's doing now, teaching photography to mostly younger students, is not putting technical skills, like dressing them up to where they don't feel like technical skills. I think what he does so well is talk about the emotion, personal expression, all these things that are so important in critical pedagogy, foregrounding those, and never it being about a right or wrong way to do the thing, which so often is what, studio training classes, film classes, it's a tutorial essentially. So I think that's been such a powerful thing of just reorienting this, of like, okay, well, when you change the light, how does that make it feel different? Oh yeah, so they look scarier now. Okay, so why is that? And so just always having that dialogue, never, kind of leaving space down the line for, okay, eventually we'll get to the critical, but finding that way to do both things at the same time seems to be the magic trick everyone I'm talking to is pulling off of never lose. And, they've just been trained as critical scholars and mostly in the professional world as well. So their mind naturally thinks that way, and kind of encouraging students to do the same seems to be, yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but I'm sure somebody could pick it up and articulate it better. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my whole approach as a professor is that the technology is a tool. I mean, I'm one of these people who I really try to demystify the technology. I don't glorify the technology. I don't obsess about the technology. For me, I mean, the technology, of course, is important. We need to know it, and we need to be able to articulate those skills and do them. But at the same time, ideas become sort of secondary almost, and I'm really reluctant to just train technicians. And so I think it's really important to see the technology as a tool, and then, find the balance with the ideas. And are the ideas interesting? Because if we have a really slick, beautiful show, but the ideas aren't there, then what's the point? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to find that balance, but it's hard in a production class sometimes because there is so much technology and you have to focus so much time and energy on learning the various apparatuses or the software or the cameras. So that is a challenge to bridge them, I feel. And I think there's some programs that do that really well. And then there's others that are trying to do it. And there's others that really don't do it at all. So it really depends on the mission of the department. And, another thing we talked about was, in this space, we're not a business. And like how great that is that we're not constrained by those. We're not constrained by advertising, we're not constrained by having to make money. We have so much freedom to make this show about media literacy. How wonderful is that? And that when you go work in the industries, that freedom is very limited. or it depends on which aspect of the industry you're working in. But if it's a more mainstream, you're very much impacted by commercial interests, whereas independent alternative media, there's a more freedom with that creatively, but there's also less money, So it's kind of like, it's also an example of doing that and having that freedom that I think is really important to understand.
David, if I could just jump in and ask, what about buy-in? I'm thinking like Gonzaga. I was at University of Oregon, so I know the sports thing, was a huge thing. And so we had students who, they were there because they wanted to, work for ESPN. They wanted to like cover Ducks football or Gonzaga basketball. Like, to get them to buy into critical concepts was the difficult thing. Even if you have the space, as you do, you have the space, but are students really going to want to get on board with this? And how do you encourage that?
Yeah, I mean, if I had $1 for every student who wanted to work for ESPN, I could probably retire. I feel our program's pretty, it is kind of conventional in some ways, but there is critical thinking, and they get a lot of critical thinking in other classes outside the major. I felt like, at least from my point of view, the buy-in was pretty good. I mean, I think it was a different idea and a different project, and we were going to do other projects too. We weren't going to just do alternative projects the whole semester. So my sense was people were interested in it. But maybe Harry is a better gauge for that because he's amongst the students. Maybe Harry could chime in here and give his perspective. I mean, my sense was people were pretty on board. I mean, some people are more interested than others, it felt like. And I don't think a tremendous majority of the students are sports broadcasters in that class. Some of them, yeah, for sure, but not the whole class. But yeah, there is that kind of divide. But I think showing them the documentary, not just the game, which is about like radical politics in the history of sports. Like, all the sports kids are like, love that film now. They're like, wow, social justice in sports, and like this strong connection. But anyway, I'll let Harry, I'd be curious to hear Harry's point of view too.
Yeah, I think coming into the broadcast department, that was one of my first frustrations. Was I felt like a lot, actually on my part, I feel like a lot of people were interested in that sports aspect. And I thought that was interesting because that wasn't necessarily why I joined the program. And it's not even necessarily what the program is designed for in itself. But I think a lot of students do end up going on that path once they leave. But I think what's interesting is in the last couple of years, the department's been developing with kind of the journalism department to create more of like a filmmaking aspect of the department. It's not fully like functioning yet, but we do have, I've personally taken a class on documentary filmmaking and a creative filmmaking class. So there are like other little bits of avenues where students can take a class or two to get skills outside of the traditional broadcasting, sports broadcasting world, so that they have different options once they graduate.
So
I think, can I just add one thing before we?
Absolutely. No, and I just wanted to acknowledge that value people's time. If people need to go, that this was the end of the session. But of course, we want to continue this rich conversation. And I would like to jump in as well. But Lucius, please.
I think just to add to all this, it hasn't been talked about much. We talked a lot about Freire at this conference, but I think Rancière's work on the ignorant schoolmaster, I think that really fits with the idea that it's not just a replacement system. And I think JD touched on that when he was talking about if we only teach skills, it becomes a replacement system of whoever else has already been doing it, and whoever else is already in power can do that. And then that person can choose who they are allowing to get that. And I think that's a big problem with equity when we're talking about this. And I think there's a lot more about what people get from production, not just necessarily to become that producer or that CEO that was described there. And I think it's a lot more layered than that, than just a replacement system. So just to add that as a layer to this.
I mean, to return for a moment to the role of the technology and also this question of buy-in, something that Carl Bybee was sharing in was it session 2C or 2B yesterday was, flipping that saying of if every problem you see is a nail, then the hammer, that kind of like saying that the hammer is itself actually a cultural byproduct, is produced through how we have historically seen problems and solutions, and to think of our technologies in those ways as cultural artifacts and not simply as neutral tools that we can design with. And I think that really resonated for me. But I really loved, in Carla, your work around this notion of the community walk and seeing the ways that people are translanguaging through print text, or seeing the ways in which there are notions of a dominant language, or what sorts of linguistic resources are valued. And Lucius, your way of through all of those resources, navigating that tension between, hey, let's talk about media, and let's do what I'm pretending is a critical analysis, but is actually just me giving my own reading to students, not actually welcoming and inductively inviting the participants to bring in their experiences and their desires and things that they're actually interested in engaging with, I think is so powerful. And that's one of the things I really take away from this session, are thinking creatively about how to get that buy-in in an inductive way. So we're not, as whatever space we're working in, for me, thinking about teacher education, kind of saying, this is the text we're analyzing, and these are sort of the modes of analysis, but really letting go of that position of power as much as possible to welcome other texts and other modes of analysis that the people we're in dialogue with bring to the space.
I actually got an idea from Carla's presentation that we could do like a pack. Like if we were to do another media literacy show down the road, we could do one of the packs in another language, and that would be really cool.
Yeah.
I hadn't even considered that, but seeing your presentation gave me that idea.
This is one of the things we're thinking. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm putting together a proposal for a language scholars program on our campus, where we can integrate different ways of letting students use their linguistic resources in different ways, and capstone projects and all kinds of things. And I'm the editor of a journal, it's based out of Europe, called Intercultural Education. And we can't, even with our publisher, major publisher, we want to do special issues in other languages, and they won't do it.
Yeah, no, we're working on a handbook, Raul and I and a few other people, that we wanted to originally publish in multiple languages. And it was the same sort of thing. And this is something that we're hoping that this space can become. Like, we value ideas for future conferences and gatherings and sharing work. How do we make it multilingual? How do we create some sort of, translation services or so that people really can dialogue across contexts without having to fall into what you were talking about, Carla, these mythological notions of, languages of commerce, or, the dominant language of business, or any of these sorts of things. And that's certainly a challenge to try to think about, because we have the platforms to share the work, but we just don't always have the means of communicating. Well, I think we are a little over time. So if anyone wants to stay on, I'm happy to hold the space. But I just want to say again, thank you to all of the presenters for sharing their work. If anyone didn't get a chance to look at the videos beforehand, the links are still live. So please go and check out all of that work. And thank you all for a great session. We now have an hour break, and we'll have sessions starting up at Pacific time, 1:30 in the afternoon, and whatever time that is where all of you are. And we hope to see you at those sessions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Feel free to
Noah.
stick around
Thank
if
you.
you want to continue to dialogue.
GD, you're a duck?
It was my master's program. I was there from, or at
Okay.
least one of the championships, which was, tough time to teach. Yeah.
That's where I did my doctorate. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was out of there 2014 to 16 was when I was there. So
Yeah, 2010 is.
Okay, just missed you. Just
when
missed
I
you.
graduated.
Yeah.
But yeah, Harry is interested in potentially applying to Oregon. He's so you did the master's in.
I did. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Harry, make sure they try to pay you to go there. Make sure you TA. It's an option. They're going to try to make you pay money. You can do it though. I watched your essay. You've got critical skills. Don't settle on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. I had I was so interested in assessment. Lucius, your presentation was the one that really made me think of it. Carla, it might apply to yours as well. But Lucius, I was just thinking about, like, I'm talking about kind of balancing technical and critical. And it struck me as you were going through your examples, you're balancing even more than that. You're balancing certainly expression in terms of students, but there's also linguistic capability in terms of expressing themselves in English. So grammatical things. And then there's also content, right? In terms of the websites being, aesthetically well laid out. So, and Carla, I think as well, in terms of, again, linguistic proficiency, which does have to be a goal. I mean, they're trying to build a skill that they can apply, but then also that expression. What's the balance you strike between those two?
Yeah, like I ask my students to, come up with multimedia presentations of their work when I pose it as a longer project, like I do in the social linguistics class. And that's what I struggle with. Of course, I want to, I focus the grading, the assessment on the analysis they did of the content.